Get out of here before dark. Go ahead.
She needs the podium to put
Right
it
here,
up.
podium.
Yeah.
I'm gonna sit over here, so I turn and look.
Can you get around?
Robert, there's a podium up there if you wanna use it.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry to be late, but a little confusion about which bank building it was, so
Oh,
I'm glad to be here.
glad you're here.
My family's interested in what you're about. I'm sorry. That somebody's traced my family back to Germany in the 1400s,
Nice.
and people like Rona have gotten information from us over the years on our records, and always glad to share what we have. What Jeff said that had asked him to do something about the history of funeral directing in Morgan County. So that's what I plan to share with you a little bit. I'm 87, and so I go back a good bit ways in experiences with the history. In Decatur, the first funeral home that I'm aware of was Brown Funeral Home. And I believe Mr. Calvin Brown, and probably in the late 1800s. And about the 1940s to 60s, Brown Funeral Home, Mr. Pinky Brown. I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember Mr. Pinky, but he was coroner for a long time, well-known person. And if I remember correctly, the funeral home was kind of across the street from the old courthouse.
Yes.
Right along in there, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
In Hartselle, the first business that was sort of a funeral home was Cosby Hardware and Furniture Company. And it began probably around 1900. My dad was Elliot Peck, and he worked for the Bank of Hartselle, and he actually worked there when had the great robbery in Hartselle in 1926. In 1929, Daddy bought the Cosby Hardware and Furniture Company. And in that store, they had a room set aside, just had caskets in there, ready-made caskets. Some people would come in and just buy their casket and just handle everything on their own. Some people would make their own caskets, and they would come in and buy handles to go in the caskets and interiors to go inside to make it look nice. Back then, embalming was usually done in the homes. And the embalmer and assistant would go out to the home with the equipment and do the embalming. And then they'd bring the casket out, place the casket, body in the casket, and the body would stay there till time for the funeral. Sometimes the funerals were held in homes, sometimes held in churches. When the embalming was started to be done in the funeral homes, the body would be brought to the funeral home and embalmed, and then carried back out to the home, and it would stay there until time for the funeral. And what we call the visitation now, or the wake, was held there at the home. And some of the old timers remember sitting up at the home. And neighbors or friends would take turns and splitting up the night and visiting. In the churches, years ago, a lot of time the custom was when the funeral was held, and then at the end of the service, if the family wished, then the casket would be opened again, and then what we call passing around. And family or friends or whoever wanted to would go around and view the body for the last time. Something that we don't have now, Eric, but might check with Kathy and see if that'd work out. We had church funeral, then you'd have flower girls. So one of our jobs at the funeral home would be to call the missionary society or whatever church group and tell them that Mrs. Smith's funeral is going to be up to church tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and we'd like for you ladies to come up there and help bring flowers in the church and take them out afterwards. So that worked pretty well, except sometimes some of the ladies become so interested that when you get everything arranged, they say, well, we got too many red ones over here, and too many pink ones over here, so we need to kind of redo it. So we all work together. The transportation way back there, sometimes they would have a flatbed wagon with horses or mules to pull to get the casket to the church and to the cemetery. And then of course sometimes they had the old type of carriage with the glass windows. My dad bought the first motor-driven hearse that was in Hartselle. He said it was kind of a van type of thing, just a small thing. Something that the funeral homes all did, and it seemed to go along with the funeral homes, is have an ambulance service. So you had a vehicle there that was a hearse, and then with just a little turning over a table or two, you could make that hearse into a flat bed where you could have a cot in there to use as an ambulance. We had on the ambulances, when they would come from the factory, they'd have the light with the siren up on the top of the hearse, and then sometimes we'd have a little portable light that you set up on the hood and use that. And sometimes if the wasn't an escort available, we'd put that on the car and use that to lead a funeral procession. And one thing that was different back then was that there were no cell phones, nothing like that. And so if you had an ambulance service, especially in funeral homes too, somebody had to be on call 24/7. And you had to be by a land phone. Or if I was going down to the People's Drugstore, I'd say, I won't say I'll be back in a few minutes. I'll say, I'm going to People's Drugstore and you can call me down there if you need me. During World War II, I guess it's a little bit like now, the situation about people having help, but it was hard to have enough help to run the funeral home because most able-bodied men were in the service. So they relied mostly on elderly people or students to help out to help make things run. And my mother helped my dad a lot during that time. In Hartselle, at that time, there was not a city hall or a police station. And so they worked out an arrangement. The funeral home was just a couple of doors from the main intersection in Hartselle there, at Main Street and Spartan Street. And so they decided they could put a desk for the police department inside the front lobby of the funeral home. It's just off the sidewalk there. And so they had a desk in the home telephone. And in the daytime, when the police would be walking, patrolling the streets, they didn't actually have a police car. They just used their own cars. But if a call came in, then somebody from the funeral home would answer the phone for them and relay the message. Well, then that worked fine. And then at night, my dad had to work every day till 9 o'clock at night. And so when he went home at night, then the police would answer the phone for him. And so we didn't live far from downtown. And if there was an emergency call, the police would call Daddy, and then they would start the ambulance, raise the door while Daddy was getting down there to take off. And so also, they didn't have a fire department, it was a volunteer fire department. And so they had to have some way to notify volunteers when there was a fire. So where do you think they put the telephone for the fire department? It was right outside the funeral home on the wall there. And there was a loud buzzer. But if this phone rang, you could hear it all up and down the street. So whoever answered the phone, it might be somebody from a drugstore across the street, or the Citizens Bank, or somebody from a funeral home, or the police if they were around. So when you answered the phone, there was a button there, and that connected by wire somewhere, I guess, up to the water tower up on the hill. And so when you took the call, then you mash that button, and you could hear the siren, the old type of siren. You hear that all over town. And the volunteer firemen would come and find out where the fire was. And so in a way, right there at that one location, it was kind of like a 911 center. You could call for the police or fire or ambulance, all the same place, a lot going on right there. Back in the 1930s and 40s, Drinkard funeral homes had funeral homes around in North Alabama, and their headquarters in Fogville, and they had a funeral home in Hartselle. And so when they decided to get out of business, then Daddy bought their business and their building, which was right across the street, right across the railroad from the depot in Hartselle. And so it was a large building, had apartments upstairs, and some of the employees from the funeral home lived up there, and then other people in town rented apartments there at times too. So our place was located there till 1965, and then moved out on the highway. Of course, it's always unusual things, and if you could think of everything, you could write a book about things that happened. But some of the things like getting to the church and the minister had the wrong date and didn't show up for the funeral. You have to go look up the minister. Had occasion where there was a storm at the cemetery, and the tent fell down on the minister while he was praying, and so he just knelt on down, finished praying, and he made it all right. Sometimes you have family feuds, which is very trying on everybody. Some of the things that are different now is that have modern buildings, the funeral homes do, and you have space for parking, which at most houses there's not much space for people parking for visiting. And it's more comfortable and roomy for visitation. Funeral homes have chapels that are available for funerals, and of course people have choice, use a church, a chapel, or a graveside. But a lot of the services now are at the chapel. A lot of the things now that back in the old days you didn't do, I guess wasn't needed, but the times changed. But professional services, like the funeral home does planning and coordinating of the funeral. Different people that work with, like the ministers, the florists, whoever's doing the music, the police escort, all kinds of paperwork. When the funeral starts, and most of our work is already completed. Things like filling out Social Security forms, insurance forms, death certificates. You've probably seen in the paper where, I believe it was Lauderdale County, where the coroner was under investigation for not filing death certificates. And that's a very, very important thing. If you can't get a death certificate, you can't collect insurance or transfer money from the bank or retirement, whatever. So that's very, very important. The funeral homes kind of act as a banker or go between people that have to be paid a lot of times, and between them and the family. The obituaries, getting that in the paper and correctly and getting it in by time for the deadline, that's a big job. And I want to tell you that Eric's wife certainly does a super job, and I don't know how she does all that she does, but with the flowers and having the florist, and we really appreciate working with her. Very good. I guess y'all are probably aware about the cemetery books, or most of you, that the ladies, Ms. Walls and Ms. Marine did, and we have copies of them at the funeral home, and we have people come by, especially people from out of state, looking for their relatives, and so sometimes they can find them by looking in those books. Of course, we have things now that didn't used to have government regulations like OSHA, and which adds a lot to what you're doing, how you're doing things. But most of it is good regulations as far as we're concerned about keeping public and employees safe. The funerals, we feel like that there's value in having a funeral or a visitation or a memorial service, and it gives a chance for the family to meet and greet the friends, and they can come and offer their support. And some people say, well, they don't want to come because they don't know what to say. But to me, it doesn't really matter what you say. They're not going to remember that anyway. But the thing they'll remember is if you came. And so I feel like this helps the family through the grief process. And you don't have to see somebody in the grocery store 6 months afterwards, and then you haven't had a chance to speak to them. And it just a lot of advantages in that. The funeral homes are there just to provide a service to try to do things that the family needs done, and to help them think of things that they need to do, and get everything carried out, and things you do before the funeral, and during, and then afterwards. And so it's just intended to be a service to help the family in carrying out their wishes. And so that's kind of the things I thought about to talk to you about. Jeff Halbros was to be here today, and there was a funeral this afternoon. Someone had a tragic death, accidental, and so he needed to be there and help that family. And so I've come in his stead, and so I'm glad to be here with you. I sure appreciate Mr. Wiry, all the work that he does, and he works with the Hartselle Historical Society a lot, and it's good to come and give us programs. And we've had enjoyed having the lunch and learn things in Hartselle, and I think maybe try to get started again this year when things get worked out. So I don't know, do any of you have anything else? That's what yes ma'am.
I have a question.
Yes.
That, it's like an emblem, like a scroll emblem that you see on the side of hearses sometimes. I was wondering what that was and what the history of that was.
Some of the hearse companies have a symbol, like a superior, or so I'm not sure if that's what you've seen. And some funeral homes have symbols. But there's one nationwide funeral home, maybe you might call it chain, but they call it Serenity, and I think they have an S, but I'm not sure exactly what it looks like.
Are you talking about the thing that looks like?
It's like a scroll,
Right.
Like a long S or something like that.
I believe it's a holdover from when the hearses used to be carriages. It was some part of the. I'm not really sure, but it's this kind of S thing that's on the side of many hearses.
Yeah, well, you're probably true. I should know, but
Thank you.
sure, yes. Yes, ma'am.
I'm asking for somebody that could not be here today. Do you have the records back to 1929 when the funeral home was started?
No, ma'am. Our records, I believe, go to 1944.
1944, okay. Are those, and she wanted to know if they were accessible to the public.
We can help the family with getting information from them.
Okay,
There's a lot of files and everything,
yes,
but we'd be glad to help anybody who wants to come by.
yes,
Be
thank you.
happy to. Yes, sir. Phil.
You talked about Calvin Brown. In the story we've heard about Calvin Brown, that he was buried on top of his wife Fanny. I think they call that double deep. Have you ever heard of people being buried on top of other people?
Yes, sir.
How common is that?
Some cemeteries do that. I believe that it's possible to do that at Burning Tree Cemetery. I believe at West Point they do that. The military. I mean, not West Point.
Phil, you remember
At Washington.
Uncle Raymond Baker?
Yeah.
He's buried at Decatur Cemetery, and his wife is buried on top of him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
didn't
We
know
all
that.
thought it was.
Decatur City that are like that.
So,
Somebody asked me the other day how many are like that at Decatur City Cemetery. I didn't know if it was a dozen or 6 or 7 or how many, but I had no idea.
I'm sure if you knew back in the time of the flu epidemic, it would be interesting to have the information, or if it's much information. I know there is something about the doctors in Decatur Cemetery, but I don't really have any. Yes.
When did embalming become common?
Well, I believe some of it started during the Civil War, but it didn't become common until probably around 1900. I think. I'm not exactly sure about that.
Okay.
I could kind of tell a funny story regarding funerals in the Peck funeral home. Back in the late 50s, early 60s, my family owned a flower shop there on Main Street in Hartselle. And of course, we had to have an extension to the phone at our house too.
Sure.
And people would call if they had a death. They'd call in the middle of the night. I gotta have a casket piece. We gotta have it right now.
Yeah, right.
So, mother was told about, in the middle of the night, making flowers and taking them up to the funeral home when it was there across the railroad tracks.
Yes.
Taking it up there in the middle of the night. Of course,
Okay.
big people sitting up probably back then too.
Yes, ma'am.
So I had to take those flowers right then. So I couldn't
which
wait till the
flowers?
next day.
Which florist was?
It was Baker's Florist.
Oh yes. Yeah,
Remember?
sure.
So, she told more than once she had to, get up, go take flowers up there during the night. It's like, just couldn't wait till morning.
And then she worked from out on 6 Mile Road.
She did.
Later after she retired, I believe.
Yes, opened her own shop out there.
Yeah.
Yes. So,
And so, in the first, when I became involved, it was customary for the florist to furnish the flower truck.
Yeah.
And say, well, Baker's has the
They did.
blanket flowers, so they furnished the flower
they
truck.
did, yes.
And then now it was the funeral homes furnish the flower truck.
Right.
And so that is a big job as far as the florist and the funeral home, as far as handling flowers and everything.
The florist business is not near as big now as far as flowers for funerals like it used to be.
That's right. Yes, ma'am.
Big change there.
Right. Well, it's not dark. Is it too early to quit? Yes, ma'am.
I heard this, and I'm just wondering if it's true. I don't know how long ago this was, maybe in the 1800s, but when people died, say they were like a notorious person, a killer or something, or they said they would bury them, put them in the casket upside down. Is that true?
I don't know. It probably might be. And,
You hadn't buried anybody upside down yet then.
and I know of one grave out at Friendship out south of Danville where the person was buried standing up.
Sir.
Oh, wow.
And I'm not sure. Maybe you can remember the verse. Remember me as you pass by, as I am now. You will be as I can't. Can you say it?
That was in Harry, isn't it, Robert?
Well, it may be, and I think there's one at Friendship too.
Oh,
As
okay.
you are now, so once was I. Remember, friend, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, soon you will be. Prepare for death and follow me.
Wow. Yeah.
That's right. That's every
Yep.
one of it.
And at one time,
There's one of those in the old Providence Cemetery in Faultville, or out in Faultville.
yeah, I'd like to go there sometime if it's not too snaky. You get
There's
there.
another one, I can't remember the words to it, but it something similar, a follow-up to that, and wanted to know where you went. Follow me, I don't know where you went,
Mr. Peck, I remember, I was a child, but my first experience at a funeral home was the brick funeral home
across from the railroad track up on to me, it was up on a big hill.
Yes, ma'am.
And when Mom and Daddy got me in there, I was scared to death.
Uh-huh.
Scared to death. I was probably maybe 5 years old,
Yes.
maybe, if I was that old. But it was my great grandmothers that had passed away, and we all had to go,
Oh, yeah.
you know. But I remember that. Now that building is gone, right?
It is,
The Methodist Church is right in there somewhere, isn't it?
the Methodist Church is a block over and up on the hill,
Okay.
but Hartselle was to have urban renewal, and so they purchased several buildings downtown Hartselle, and those buildings were torn down, but the urban renewal never went through the funding, or something didn't work out.
The old armory was right next to that building too, and they tore it down too, isn't that right?
Yeah, that's
Ron?
right.
At the same time.
Yeah. And I can remember as a child, Dad's funeral home was down there next to the intersection, and there was a long hallway back to the back, and the embalming room was back to back. It wasn't lit very well. I'd always kind of get down that hallway pretty fast.
It seemed like of course I was a child, but it seemed like to me there was a hallway in that building, and there was rooms, but there were, I can remember we stood in the hall, the rooms were small.
Yes, very small. There really wasn't adequate room to have. You could have a funeral there, but it was very, very small. Yes.
But back then, I may be wrong, but didn't most people take families to the church then?
They did. Yes, ma'am. Sure did. And carried the families, the bodies back to the home for visitation.
What about the tradition of people preparing food and bringing it to the home? When did that begin?
I don't know. As far as back as I know, I imagine for a long, long time.
And that kind of like a regional thing? I mean, I don't think
Well, it could be.
everyone in say, Oregon does that. I mean, you know.
The decorations, I think, is a regional thing, and began in the South. And I don't know if you have it in other parts of the country, or did you have it in Oregon? You said
It's an Appalachian thing, I believe. It's I believe it's mostly an Appalachian tradition.
Yeah, it used to be a really, really big thing, you
Yes.
know, back then.
an all-day singing and dinner on the
Yeah, I mean,
grounds.
it's a big day for Florida too.
Yeah, sure was. And back during the 40s, there wasn't a florist in Hartselle, and so Daddy would get flowers from City Park Florist in Decatur, and when there was to be an Easter or Christmas or something, he'd display the pot plants around there, just inside the funeral home, where you see them walking up and down the street, and then we would come down to Decatur and pick up the flowers like the night before the holiday, and then take them down and deliver them. And I guess McCullough's probably was the first florist.
It's the first one I remember.
Yes. Yes.
And so Kathy Sumford has purchased the Smith florist in Hartselle, and so they're doing all the flower work in Hartselle now. And I don't believe there's one in Danville or Fogville together.
No, sir. They both were.
But so she does a really good job to keep them busy. So, is there anything else? If not, I enjoyed being with you. And, appreciate.
We appreciate you being here. Thank you very much.
We
Thank you.
enjoyed it very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.